Nina, this is a different S hits the fan to a usual episode because this is contemporaneous. We have the midterms, and
Absolutely.
you as an expert in the thinking about what guides the American market and consumer with regard to sustainability, ESG, investment, and all of those other concerns. We're going to discuss today some of the key points or the pivot points for the US as it goes into the midterms. What would you say, and we have so much on the table, but what would you say would be the key things that are front and center as far as the consumer is concerned and the politics of the consumer are concerned for the US?
Well, there is a lot on the table, but from an ESG perspective, and of course, as a BHR professional, I'll focus mostly on what I consider a really big risk, which is the S risk. And this is, when S hits the fan. So here we are. I think one of the interesting issues that hit the BHR community that was working and engaging with companies and investors was the Roe v. Wade reversal and the Dobbs decision, right? So all of a sudden, companies had to start thinking, wait a minute, how are we going to respond to our employees? Because employees are exceedingly important in the whole ESG discussion. How are we going to protect our employees? Do we have a policy? If we are in some restrictive states, we have to have a policy. They didn't have a policy, right? So all of a sudden, do we cover health benefits? Do we cover travel? Do we cover hotel stays? And we haven't quite seen this yet, but do we cover the $10,000 penalty, like in Texas, that they may levy on people facilitating? And that might be the companies. It might be a good way to raise money. I don't know. It has really shaken up companies. And if they haven't been shaken up, they really have to, because in terms of talent attraction and retention, it's a huge issue. Who at this point, woman or man or family that is being asked to transfer to Texas to work for AT&T or Hewlett Packard or Texas Instrument, any of these companies, who in their right mind really would accept an interesting, generous offer? You might say, I love the job, but can I do it from Massachusetts or somewhere else? Because it's really going to impact your family.
Just for the rest of the world who may not quite appreciate the distinction between a federal level position and a state level position. I mean, a lot of people consider the United States as this kind of contiguous whole. And it's only perhaps recently that people are realizing that there may well be two countries within the states, the red and the blue. Can you just break that down a bit so that we have some context? What's the difference between somebody from Massachusetts not choosing to go to a job in Texas?
Right. Well, remember, we're the United States of America, maybe not so united, but they're states. And the Roe reversal and the Dobbs decision basically said, look, it wasn't a great decision in the first place, Roe, but what we're going to do is let states decide whether they want to provide abortions or not. If in some states may decide to make it illegal and in fact penalize people helping others getting abortion or women themselves, right? So all of a sudden, the northern states being, I'm making great generalities, but in general, the northern states have been more pro-abortion, and the southern states, starting with Texas, but Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, have been more restrictive on abortion. So it really does depend where you are located in terms of what rights you have, what reproductive and privacy rights, may I add, whether they're protected or not, and whether you could be put in jail. So it becomes all of a sudden quite important where you are located.
Let's say we take the environmental aspect and then its relationship to the market and compare this now with the social condition that the reversal of Roe has imposed. When California makes legislation about low emission vehicles, and that state law has changed the entire market for how vehicles are produced, because if you can't sell in California, what's the point of making a car in the US? Is there a kind of reverse consequence here for Texas? And is that what you're saying, that you're going to lose top employees, people are not going to enroll in the university, all sorts of things are going to happen in Texas, and really that's going to pull the market away from opportunities in Texas, or Texas is going to be pulled away from the market for opportunities.
I don't think the state legislatures of some of these regressive states understand the business aspect here, because clearly it's going to not be productive. It's going to lower their tax dollars if fewer people come study at state universities or universities in Texas, and they're great universities in Texas, or accept jobs at some of these companies. So all of a sudden, they may have less money to work with. So there will be some kind of impact. The problem with the issue of life or pro-life is that if you listen to some of the right-wing radio that I listen to, unfortunately, they are saying there are no economic discussions here. You cannot be swayed by economics, and we will not be swayed by economics. We'll see what happens here, because this is not a normal thing. If you believe that that life begins at conception, some of these state legislatures will be saying, okay, we're ready to lose money. I don't know how long that's going to last.
I mean, it's interesting that they should take a position like that with regard to it's not an economic issue, but when it comes to student debt forgiveness and the righteousness of that and not looking at the past and so forth, then it is an economic issue, because we're now saddling, future taxpayers with the cost of this issue. But what about the cost of future taxpayers for all of the children that now have to be born as a consequence of people not being able to make the choice, and then all of the welfare that needs to be put in place in order to ensure that those children are not left behind, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Does this not kind of not make sense?
Well, they're not looking at the economics. And in fact, it's really hard. You know how many children are in foster care in each of these states. I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of children, costing the state a ton of money, right? So nobody's, and it's actually quite expensive to adopt a child. So when these justices say, well, you can have the child and put it up for adoption, not that many people can and have the money to adopt. So the economic arguments are not really falling into place here. So this is, right to life is a difficult issue. And we're going to see whether some of these regressive states will see the light. But right now, they are really entrenched, and it's very hard. So in terms of ESG and working with investors, and I've worked with some investors in terms of mapping out their portfolio to see which companies are headquartered in which states, and what does that mean? And are you engaging with them in terms of looking at this as a risk? And it's not only in terms of finding a nice package, a healthcare package, but hoping that they are engaging with the state legislatures in terms of telling them that this is not good for business. This is not good for us. Patagonia, I have to say, is one of those outliers, because they not only are paying the health package and everything else, but they are saying, we will pay your bail if you get arrested for protesting for reproductive rights. So, they've always been an outlier, but I have to say, I love them.
I mean, it's good that this discussion has now allowed certain companies to double down on their professed value.
Right.
And so Patagonia, it's great that they're doing what they're doing, of course, but it also, I think, is calling out those companies that have said certain things, but suddenly, the line has been drawn in the sand. Are you going to go that extra mile to protect whatever it is that you say that you hold dear?
Well, listen, and it's not only reproductive rights. So, we need to look at the different rights from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as good BHR professional does, right? So we're talking privacy rights, and we saw what happened in Florida with Disney, right? All of a sudden, Governor DeSantis comes out with a don't say gay law, which says, you won't be able to use the word gay in schools under third grade, but it's also very detrimental for parents who are gay couples or gay teachers. It makes very different. So all of a sudden, the Disney employees woke up and took a look at where Disney was actually contributing, and they said, oh my God, we as a company, our shareholder money has been going to some of these state legislators and the Governor DeSantis, and that money is actually fueling a very law that we are really adamantly opposed to. So they brought this to the attention of the CEO, who had to then reverse, do a correction here, spoke out, and as a result, DeSantis basically said, you know what, you have a problem with it, I'm revoking your tax exempt status in Florida. So there's this whole escalation going on with companies that are speaking out. There was, again, on LGBTQ rights. Let's look at voting rights. I think the first one to start the whole conversation was Georgia, when they were restricting the voting rights in Georgia. And all of a sudden, there are lots of really important companies in Georgia, starting with Coca-Cola, right? So all of a sudden, it's like, where are you in this discussion? It's your headquarters. Are you weighing in on this or not? And so all of a sudden they had to say, it took a while, but they finally weighed in. And it took, unfortunately, the Black executives, CEOs like Ken Chenault former CEO of Amex, and Ken Fraser of Merck, who said, we can't stand by and not engage on this. This is ridiculous. So we're talking voting rights, privacy rights, and that includes LGBTQ and reproductive rights. All of these companies need to be much more aware that we need to be vigilant in our own country and in the states where we are headquartered. Because I think in the past, all of the BHR professionals were focusing like laser on the extraterritorial aspects, like what are you doing in Peru? What are you doing in the Niger Delta, and what are you doing in the DRC in terms of cobalt? But now I think maybe because of COVID, so many of us were focused and grounded in the United States that we kept saying, well, wait a minute, we should apply what we're doing in terms of the pressure on companies. We need to apply this to our own companies in their own state headquarters. So all of a sudden, I think the lens changed.
I think what is really valuable from the position of someone who can now take a position with a company and say, look, are you, living up to your principles? And what the US is demonstrating here, I suppose, is different to, let's say, the Ugandan government and homosexuality, or the Singapore government and state punishment. You've got the federal consideration of a business that's being able to operate across all the states. And even though the states in and of themselves might be like Uganda or Singapore, you now have this pressure that says, listen, are we essentially a microcosm of all of the global values that we are preaching and the democratic ideals that we are fighting for everywhere else? Are we not at least espousing and demonstrating and practicing them right here at home? And we also had to discuss the point of the discussion before, which was it not being economic. But ESG as a risk framework obviously tends towards the continuity of business and the ability for business to respond to a context. So let's say we have got this dichotomy now of the red states and the blue states, or what you have called the regressive states. And let's say those people who are in charge right now, what is the position of the GOP and ESG?
It's war, basically. And I picked this up when I was listening to this right-wing radio about a year ago, but I listened to the most extraordinary CPAC discussion, February 26th, which is the Conservative Political Action Committee, the one that also met in Hungary. And you had all these, a huge panel called Awake But Not Woke. And they were pillaring Larry Fink. I usually spend my time actually pillaring him from the other side, saying, for God's sake, you've got some good language coming out on these letters. Why don't you vote the way you write? Because he hasn't yet. And these people were considering himself the devil incarnate. You also hear Elon Musk pillaring the whole ESG movement, literally calling them the devil incarnate. But what was fascinating about that panel is the GOP, and this got all these wild applauses saying the US capital system is the greatest system to lift the population out of poverty. ESG and wokeness is a cancer. Let's kill the cancer and save the host. We're talking all out war. And the whole panel was really focused on how to use the tools that progressives have been very good about using with activist investors, and saying, well, we need to do the same thing. And we should call out these CEOs and ask for more diverse boards. And for them, diversity is diversity of political thought, as opposed to, of course, what we've been, the D&I and gender, et cetera. So it was very interesting that they said, we need to use the tools the progressive have been using. And we are seeing it now. These pension funds, like in Texas, that are saying, we're not going to be investing in BlackRock. And in Texas, they had this law passed, SB 13, which said it prevents state investment pension funds from investing in funds that exclude fossil fuels companies. And DeSantis, the governor of Florida, basically has said that the Florida state pension funds cannot invest in any funds that are using ESG analysis. I mean, go figure.
So just so that, again, for the rest of the world to understand,
Yes.
unlike the climate deniers or the climate change deniers, where there is so much evidence that one really has to ask, what's going on with you, flat earther, as opposed to, let's say, the ESG community, which has come under a lot of fire in the last few months, because sometimes really there isn't a lot of science to support it. And you should probably be resting on your cultural and values laurels to say, because it's the right thing to do. Because sometimes the abuse that's gone on with the metrics on ESG has made it, questionable. So it's really done itself no favors. Now, when the GOP comes out and says things, about the ESG, are they questioning the science, or are they questioning, this is just some kind of do-gooder, not quite understanding what's going on? So what's the argument?
So I think their argument is we should not, that investors should not be imposing their values in terms of how they decide on investments.
Like Christian values, for example.
Right. Like Christian values. But I mean, they're saying because they're most of them flat earthers. So they're saying, all this environmental stuff, that's a value. This caring about workers' rights is a value, and all of this, even though they won't even say that, because obviously they want to be Main Street as opposed to Wall Street. They are shocked that Wall Street is moving in this direction of Main Street. And I'd like to see them, shoot it out, because, please continue investing in companies, in properties on the coastline, like Mar-a-Lago and the Keys. Buy out the Florida Keys and see if that's a good long-term investment for you. Or, continue investing in companies during COVID that didn't care about their employees, didn't give any sick pay or health benefits or all that, and see where that gets you. I think they're going to find out that all the ESG investors who do their very best, and they look at it as really an analysis of risk. And these are all risks. Some of them are, as we know, more difficult to quantify, especially the S, but they're still risks. So, let them start their, woke or their anti-ESG funds and see where it gets them.
If it's come back home, if now, we have the US consumer mindset, investor mindset is beginning to recognize that the expansionist idea of Pax Americana around the world has now had to consolidate into, whether it's semiconductor chips or whether it's food sovereignty and security and all of this, we've got to be able to really look after ourselves anymore, because globalization hasn't worked out so well. So, energy prices, this, that, and the other, let's make sure that it's all at home. But within the US itself, there are some very entrenched ideas about division between races, civil liberties. I mean, that whole movement, is encapsulated by MLK.
They
you guys
hate
have defined that.
They hate Black Lives Matter. They hate it, right?
Right. So now I'm a US consumer, and the rest of the world depends on me as an individual making certain choices of what to buy, when to buy, what labels to look at, what metrics to use. How am I being affected by what's going on with politics and these things that are being told to me?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, there is a point where the left and the right do converge and agree on a point, which is on the Uyghur labor in China. And we have, in fact, a new Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which basically is a ban of anything. It's a very difficult presumption to overcome. It's a ban of any products coming out of Xinjiang or of Uyghur labor. So, and that couldn't have gotten through without serious bipartisan support. However, I have heard in all these wonderful right-wing things that I listen to, they're saying, well, Black lives seem to matter, but what about Chinese lives? Don't they matter? So, but I think in general, there is a little bit more understanding that while they might not be so big on forced labor in general, even on union labor in the United States, there is some there is some awareness that there's something not happening right in China. They called the Olympics, this CPAC panel that I listened to, the Genocide Olympics, and they were really going after Coca-Cola and Visa for being sponsors. So there we go. It's interesting.
So this situation. So let's say Xinjiang, of course, is a highly problematic situation, but it's also unfortunately twinned with the trade war that is happening.
Oh yeah.
So there is, there's all sorts of political opinions on either sides, and conspiracy theories here, there, and the other. But let's say we're talking about the migrant workers that come in to do the almond farming, or in Florida itself, we have, the coalition of Immokalee workers and tomatoes and all sorts of things, right? So how do these states, or actually even the federal government, how do you reconcile this idea that exploitation, forced labor, and all the rest of it is happening right there? And is there not a double standard when we're talking about other places?
Of course there's. We still have child labor in U.S. agriculture. Most of them migrant labor, but a lot is child labor. And one of the few ways we're going to be able to get to them, to the naysayers on having a law really that would outlaw child labor, would be to say, that tobacco that the American kids are growing, they won't be able to enter the European market once this due diligence law comes into force. So, that's an economic argument. But yes, of course, this is crazy, because the right really is the whole country, unfortunately, is based on a lot of migrant labor, which is underpaid and exploitative, right? Especially in agriculture and in hospitality. And there hasn't been enough legislation. There is federal legislation. The Biden administration has been very good also on helping on unions, and the minimum wage has gone up, but that is, a state by state decision.
So agriculture, of course, as a sector has, a feudal legacy that is difficult to undo. Whether it's all
slavery,
states and slavery, exactly, all of that is in there. So let's try to round off on the U.S. is the global poster child for capitalism and everything that comes with it. And in one of the previous discussions I'd had with Duncan Pollard, he had pointed out that all of this social injustice actually helps the cost profile when it comes to capitalist enterprises. It's actually better to have impoverished people and people in slavery, et cetera, which I think we all understand. So if the US is really going to tout its capitalist credentials, it really should be championing the continuing poverty of everybody who is servicing that machine. How is the US going to reconcile its position as being the predominant, primordial capitalist society, as well as be caring for the rest of the world?
Well, that's the, $64,000 question, because when I taught, just 5-6 years ago, the US was clearly at the forefront of business human rights issues, right? Starting with corruption. But we have lost, the US has lost its primacy there, right? And we have, Europeans have been diligently working on a whole bunch of measures. And this new due diligence directive is really gonna sort of make everybody quite aware that at least one group of states is really cares about environmental and labor issues. So the US is trying to take these piecemeal approaches and really trying to create something that is more cohesive, right? So the SEC has a very big role to play. And as you know, we are waiting for the final rule on the environmental scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions reporting. But there is also one on human capital that's extremely important, which may put the US back on the map. Public procurement is under scrutiny, absolutely, especially as we do this transition, this green transition toward EVs and batteries. Where is the cobalt coming from? Where is the polysilicon coming from? We've got solar panels absolutely, piling up at the US borders because the polysilicon comes from Xinjiang. I'm particularly concerned about what's going to happen with the indigenous populations in the United States, because some of the lithium and some of these minerals that we're trying to onboard, rare earth minerals, some of them in the US, but they're on indigenous people's land. So are we going to apply free, prior, informed consent by the UNDRIP Convention? Is the US really going to focus on really protecting the rights of individuals and moving toward a more sustainable capitalist system? I don't know, but we need all hands on deck. The SEC is fundamental in getting us there. And of course, leadership from the top. Now, if the leadership changes in 2 years, I don't see that ESG is going to be top of the list. It may be top of the list of what to slash and burn, which is why it's really important to nail in a lot of these policies the Biden administration is trying to do through the National Action Plan, including the national contact points now, so that they're self-funding, federally funded, and they can't be just undone by executive orders.
If the House changes and nothing can be done in the next 2 years, then we're really looking at sort of the lame duck of everything that has happened so far. And all of the things that you have just mentioned, which could be done in the next 2 years if the House is retained by the Democrats. What could we be looking forward to if everything goes well?
Oh, well, you're being optimistic.
I'm always optimistic.
I'm less optimistic, especially about the House. But I think a lot is being done in the executive branch, right? So that's what the Biden administration is focusing on now with the National Action Plan review. What can be done, labor, commerce. The SEC doesn't take direct instructions, but there's a very good person in charge, and that person's still in charge, and it does not have to be reviewed by Congress, right? So what can be done without congressional review? Because we're not going to have congressional review. We have Section 307 of the 1930 Trade Act, which is in place. We have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is bipartisan and in place. That's all we can expect right now. Biden administration is pushing much more on unions, on Roe v. Wade unions. A lot of these things cannot be federally enforced, right? So we've just got to hang tight and really try and get these companies to understand that it's in their best interest to engage state by state where they are located and saying this, voting rights, rolling back voting rights is not okay. Rolling back LGBTQ rights is not okay. Rolling back reproductive rights is not okay. And not to mention all the tech issues, right? The tech industry issues, privacy rights there. It's now, unfortunately, ground zero, a lot is the private sector. I hate, I'd like to say keep them out of politics. But again, Pillar 2 of the UNGPs basically says the responsibility of business to respect human rights and at a minimum those set forth in the Bill of Human Rights and the core ILO Convention. And when there is a conflict, they need to safeguard these rights for their stakeholders, i.e. their employees, right? So that's where the rubber meets the road. I'm hoping companies will understand the UNGPs a lot better and their responsibilities under it, but that's what we're facing. And so, next week, the midterms is going to be a really tough awakening. I'm hoping that these companies will stay the course.